Sarah Chen had always been the smallest person in any room she entered. At 24 years old and barely 5 feet 2 inches tall, she looked more like a college student than a federal investigator. Her colleagues at the Bureau of Financial Crimes often mistook her for an intern, despite the badge clipped to her belt and the determined set of her jaw that spoke of someone who had fought for every opportunity she had earned. The morning that would change everything started like any other. Sarah arrived at the office 30 minutes early, as she always did, clutching a cup of coffee that was probably too strong for most people but just right for someone who had spent the previous night reviewing case files until her eyes burned. The bullpen was nearly empty except for Agent Rodriguez, who nodded at her with the kind of polite acknowledgement reserved for junior staff. Sarah's desk was positioned in what everyone called the rookie corner, a collection of metal desks pushed together near the copy machine where the newest agents sat until they proved themselves worthy of better real estate. She had been there for 8 months now, longer than most rookies, and she was starting to wonder if she would ever earn the respect that seemed to come so easily to her male colleagues. The case that had been consuming her thoughts was the Meridian Corporation investigation. For 6 months, the senior agents had been trying to crack what appeared to be a sophisticated money laundering operation. Millions of dollars were flowing through shell companies, disappearing into offshore accounts, and reappearing as legitimate business investments. The paper trail was a maze of corporate filings, bank records, and international transactions that seemed designed to confuse even the most experienced investigators. Agent Marcus Webb, the lead investigator on the case, had made it clear that rookies were expected to handle the paperwork and leave the real detective work to the veterans. Sarah had been assigned to data entry and filing, tasks that most people found mind-numbing. But Sarah had discovered something that her colleagues had missed: she was exceptionally good at seeing patterns in data that others overlooked. During her lunch breaks and after hours, she had been creating her own analysis of the Meridian files. She had noticed irregularities in the timing of certain transactions, discrepancies in corporate filings that seemed too convenient to be coincidental, and connections between seemingly unrelated companies that suggested a level of coordination that went far beyond what the official investigation had uncovered. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning when Sarah was reviewing shipping manifests that had been dismissed as routine paperwork. Hidden among thousands of entries for office supplies and industrial equipment, she found a pattern that made her heart race. Certain shipments were being routed through the same warehouse in Newark, but the paperwork showed delivery addresses that didn't exist. She cross-referenced the fake addresses with property records and discovered they corresponded to vacant lots that had been purchased by subsidiaries of companies that were themselves owned by other subsidiaries in an endless chain of corporate shells. Sarah knew she had found something important, but she also knew that presenting her findings to Agent Webb would be tricky. He had already made it clear that he didn't appreciate input from junior staff, especially not from someone who was supposed to be handling clerical work. She needed to be strategic about how she approached this. She decided to start with Agent Rodriguez, who had always been more approachable than the others. She waited until the afternoon when the office had quieted down and most of the senior agents were in meetings. Rodriguez was at his desk, reviewing witness statements from an unrelated case, when Sarah approached with a manila folder clutched in her hands. "Agent Rodriguez," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I know this might be outside my assigned duties, but I've been reviewing some of the Meridian files in my spare time, and I think I've found something that might be relevant to the investigation." Rodriguez looked up from his paperwork, his expression showing mild interest mixed with the kind of patience that experienced agents reserved for eager rookies who thought they had solved cases that had stumped their superiors. "What kind of something, Chen?" Sarah opened her folder and pulled out a chart she had created showing the connections between the shell companies and the fake delivery addresses. The chart was color-coded and meticulously detailed, showing relationships that weren't immediately obvious from the individual documents. "I found a pattern in the shipping records that everyone else dismissed as routine," she explained, spreading the chart across Rodriguez's desk. "These companies are using fake addresses for deliveries, but the addresses correspond to vacant lots that are owned by other companies in the same network. I think they're using the shipping records to create false documentation for transactions that never actually involve any real goods." Rodriguez studied the chart for several minutes, his expression growing more serious as he traced the connections Sarah had identified. "How long have you been working on this?" "About 3 weeks," Sarah admitted. I know I should have been focusing on my assigned tasks, but something about these files didn't feel right. The more I looked into it, the more I realized that the shipping records might be the key to understanding how the money laundering actually works. Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, still studying Sarah's analysis. This is good work, Chen. Really good work. But, you know that Webb isn't going to appreciate a rookie second-guessing his investigation, especially not when he's been working this case for 6 months without making significant progress. Sarah felt her stomach drop. She had known this would be a risk, but she had hoped that the quality of her analysis would speak for itself. I'm not trying to second-guess anyone, she said carefully. I just thought that maybe a fresh perspective might help. Your perspective is definitely fresh, Rodriguez said with a slight smile. And, your analysis is more thorough than anything I've seen from some agents with 10 years of experience. The problem is that Webb has a reputation to maintain, and admitting that a rookie found something he missed isn't going to do his career any favors. Sarah felt a mixture of frustration and disappointment. She had spent weeks on this analysis, sacrificing sleep and personal time to uncover connections that could potentially break the case wide open. The idea that office politics might prevent her findings from being taken seriously was almost too much to bear. What if you presented the findings, she suggested. You could say that you discovered the pattern while reviewing my work, or that it came up during your own analysis. I don't need credit, I just want the investigation to succeed. Rodriguez looked at her with something that might have been respect. That's very generous of you, Chen, but it's not that simple. If these connections are as significant as they appear to be, someone is going to want to know how they were discovered. And if Webb finds out that a rookie did work that his team should have done, there's going to be consequences for everyone involved. Sarah sat down heavily in the chair beside Rodriguez's desk. She had known that being a rookie would come with challenges, but she hadn't anticipated how difficult it would be to have her work taken seriously even when it was clearly valuable. So what do I do? She asked. Do I just pretend I never found this and go back to filing paperwork? Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the implications of Sarah's discovery. Finally, he spoke. There's something you should know about the Meridian case, he said, lowering his voice. It's not just about money laundering. Intelligence sources suggest that the people behind this operation might be connected to international terrorism financing. If that's true, then what you found isn't just important for our investigation, it could be critical for national security. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had known the case was significant, but the possibility of terrorism connections elevated everything to a different level. Are you saying that the shipping records might be documenting something more than just fake transactions? I'm saying that if your analysis is correct, and these shell companies are using fake shipping records to create false documentation, then they might be using the same methods to hide transfers of money to terrorist organizations, Rodriguez explained. The warehouse in Newark that you identified, intelligence has been trying to figure out what's happening there for months. Sarah looked down at her chart with new understanding. What she had thought was clever detective work on a financial crimes case might actually be the breakthrough that law enforcement needed to prevent something much worse. What happens now? She asked. Rodriguez gathered up her analysis and stood up from his desk. Now we take this to Webb, regardless of the consequences, he said. Sometimes doing the right thing means dealing with politics later. If you're right about these connections, then we don't have time to worry about hurt feelings or damaged egos. As they walked toward Webb's office, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and terror. She had joined the bureau because she wanted to make a difference, but she had never imagined that her first real opportunity would come with such high stakes. The fact that her colleagues had underestimated her might have been frustrating, but it had also given her the freedom to pursue connections that more experienced agents had missed. Webb was on the phone when they reached his office, but Rodriguez knocked anyway. Through the glass door, they could see Webb gesture for them to wait. Sarah used the time to review her analysis one more time, making sure she could explain her reasoning clearly and concisely. When Webb finally opened his door, his expression was not welcoming. Rodriguez, I'm in the middle of coordinating with the district attorney's office about the Meridian case. Unless this is an emergency, it's going to have to wait. Actually, sir, it might be exactly the kind of emergency you're talking about, Rodriguez replied. Agent Chen has uncovered some connections in the Meridian files that I think you need to see immediately. Webb's eyes shifted to Sarah, and she could see him trying to place her. After 8 months of working in the same office, the fact that he didn't immediately recognize her was both insulting and oddly liberating. It meant that he had no preconceived notions about her capabilities. Chen, he said, finally, placing her. Aren't you the rookie who's been handling the data entry on this case? Yes, sir, Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. While reviewing the shipping records, I noticed some patterns that might be relevant to the investigation. Webb looked at Rodriguez with an expression that clearly communicated his skepticism about spending time on theories from a rookie. But Rodriguez's serious demeanor seemed to convince him to at least listen. 5 minutes, Webb said, stepping aside to let them into his office. But this better be worth interrupting my call with the DA. Sarah spread her chart across Webb's desk and began explaining her analysis. She started with the fake delivery addresses, moved on to the connections between the shell companies, and finished with her theory about how the shipping records were being used to create false documentation for money transfers. Webb listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious as Sarah continued. When she finished, he studied the chart for several minutes before speaking. How long have you been working on this analysis? He asked. About 3 weeks, sir, Sarah replied, bracing herself for criticism about working outside her assigned duties. 3 weeks, Webb repeated slowly. And, in 3 weeks, you found connections that my team missed in 6 months of investigation. Sarah wasn't sure if that was a question or a statement, so she remained silent. Webb picked up his phone and dialed an extension. Johnson, I need you in my office immediately. And, bring the intelligence files on the Newark warehouse. He hung up and looked at Sarah with an expression she couldn't quite read. Agent Chen, he said, if your analysis is correct, you may have just identified the mechanism that international terrorism financiers have been using to move money through the United States. The implications of that are significant enough to justify bringing in federal task force resources. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. The idea that her work might be important enough to involve federal task forces was both thrilling and terrifying. Agent Johnson arrived within minutes, carrying a thick folder marked with security classifications. Webb quickly explained Sarah's findings and asked Johnson to compare them with the intelligence data. Johnson spread several photographs and surveillance reports across the desk alongside Sarah's chart. The photographs showed the Newark warehouse from multiple angles, with timestamps indicating they had been taken over several months. The surveillance reports documented vehicle traffic to and from the warehouse, but the license plates had been traced to rental companies and shell corporations. The timing matches, Johnson said after reviewing Sarah's analysis. The dates when Chen identified suspicious shipping activity correspond exactly with intelligence reports of increased activity at the warehouse. Webb stood up and began pacing behind his desk. If we're right about this, then, the Meridian investigation just became a counter-terrorism operation. We need to contact the Joint Terrorism Task Force immediately. Sarah watched this conversation with a growing sense of unreality. Her analysis of shipping records had gone from being a rookie's attempt to prove herself to being potential evidence in a terrorism investigation. The magnitude of the situation was starting to sink in. Sir, she said tentatively, if the shipping records are being used to create false documentation, then, there might be other warehouses and other networks using the same methods. The pattern I found in Newark might be replicated in other cities. Webb stopped pacing and looked at her intently. Explain. The corporate structure I mapped out includes subsidiaries in 12 different states, Sarah continued. If they're using fake shipping records in Newark, they might be doing the same thing in other locations. Each warehouse could be a hub for different aspects of the operation. Johnson opened his folder and pulled out a map marked with red pins. Intelligence has been tracking suspicious financial activity in several major cities, but we haven't been able to connect the different locations. If Chen is right about the corporate network, this map might show us the full scope of the operation. Sarah looked at the map and felt a chill of recognition. The red pins corresponded almost exactly with the cities where the Meridian subsidiaries maintain addresses. Her analysis of shipping records had revealed not just one warehouse operation, but what appeared to be a national network of facilities used for terrorism financing. The room fell silent as the implications became clear. What had started as a routine money laundering investigation had revealed what might be one of the largest terrorism financing operations ever discovered on American soil. Webb reached for his phone again. "I'm calling the FBI director," he said. This case just became a matter of national security. As Webb made his call, Sarah realized that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't have imagined. The rookie who had been assigned to data entry was about to become a key figure in a counter-terrorism investigation that could affect national security. The colleagues who had underestimated her were about to discover that sometimes the most important insights come from the most unexpected sources. Within 6 hours of Webb's call to the FBI director, Sarah's small corner desk had been relocated to a secure conference room 3 floors above the regular bureau offices. The room had no windows, multiple computer terminals, and a large wall-mounted display that currently showed a map of the United States with 12 red dots marking the locations of Meridian Corporation subsidiaries. Sarah sat at a table surrounded by agents whose names she was still trying to remember. Agent Martinez from the Joint Terrorism Task Force had introduced himself with a firm handshake and an intensity that made it clear this was no longer a routine financial investigation. Agent Thompson from FBI Counterintelligence had arrived with a briefcase full of classified files that she wasn't cleared to read but was apparently qualified to help analyze. The strangest part was how everyone was treating her. 24 hours ago, she had been the rookie who fetched coffee and made copies. Now she was being asked for her opinions on strategy and tactics by agents with decades of experience. The transformation was so dramatic that she wondered if she was dreaming. "Agent Chen," Martinez said, pulling her attention back to the present, "we need you to walk us through your analysis again, but this time I want you to focus on the timing patterns. Intelligence suggests that the terrorist financing network might be coordinating their activities with events in the Middle East." Sarah moved to the whiteboard and began sketching out the timeline she had identified. The suspicious shipping activities followed a pattern that repeated every 3 to 4 weeks, with increased activity around certain dates that had seemed random when she first noticed them. "The dates that show the highest volume of fake shipments are here, here, and here," she said, marking the whiteboard. "I originally thought they might correspond to business cycles or fiscal reporting periods, but now that I look at them in the context of international events..." Thompson interrupted. "Those dates align perfectly with intelligence reports of increased communications between known terrorist cells in Syria and Lebanon. The timing suggests that the shipping records are being created to document money transfers that coincide with operational planning." Sarah felt a mixture of pride and anxiety. Her analysis was proving to be even more significant than she had realized, but the implications were becoming increasingly serious. "If the pattern holds," she continued, "the next period of increased activity should be in approximately 2 weeks. Martinez leaned forward. 2 weeks gives us time to set up surveillance on all 12 locations, but not much time to plan a coordinated operation. We're going to need detailed intelligence on each facility, and we're going to need it fast." Agent Webb, who had been quiet through most of the briefing, finally spoke up. "Agent Chen, I know this is far beyond what we initially expected from your assignment, but we need you to expand your analysis to all 12 locations. The patterns you found in Newark might help us understand what's happening at the other sites." Sarah nodded, trying to process the magnitude of what she was being asked to do. "I'll need access to all the shipping records, corporate filings, and financial data for every subsidiary. And I'll need to cross-reference everything with property records and business licenses in each city." "You'll have whatever you need," Martinez assured her. "We're bringing in additional analysts to support you, but you're going to be the lead on the data analysis. The patterns you identify will determine how we deploy resources for the surveillance operation." The next several days blurred together in a haze of databases, spreadsheets, and late-night analysis sessions. Sarah found herself working 18-hour days, sustained by coffee and the growing realization that her work might prevent terrorist attacks on American soil. The additional analysts Martinez had promised turned out to be experienced agents who treated her not as a rookie but as the lead investigator on the most important aspect of the case. Agent Lisa Park from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit became Sarah's primary partner in the expanded analysis. Park had 15 years of experience tracking international money laundering, but she readily admitted that Sarah's pattern recognition skills were unlike anything she had encountered. Most agents look for obvious connections, Park explained during one of their late-night work sessions. Large transactions, unusual account activity, communications between known suspects. But you're finding connections that are designed to be invisible. The fake shipping records, the timing patterns, the geographic distribution, it's like you're seeing a language that the rest of us don't speak. Sarah appreciated the compliment, but she was starting to understand that her analytical approach was just different rather than necessarily better. I think it might be because I don't have preconceived ideas about how these operations are supposed to work, she replied. I'm looking at the data without assumptions about what I should find. Their analysis of the other 11 locations revealed a sophisticated network that was even more complex than they had initially understood. Each warehouse served a specific function in the overall operation. The Newark facility appeared to focus on East Coast operations, while locations in Miami, Houston, and Los Angeles handled different geographic regions and different types of financial transfers. The pattern became clear when Sarah created a comprehensive timeline that showed the flow of fake shipments between facilities. Money was being moved in a carefully choreographed sequence that made it nearly impossible to track using conventional methods. Funds would enter the system through one facility, be documented as payment for fake shipments to another facility, transferred again with different documentation, and eventually emerge as apparently legitimate business investments. It's brilliant, in a terrible way, Park observed as they studied Sarah's timeline. Every transfer looks completely legal on paper. The shipping records provide justification for every payment, and the corporate structure makes it almost impossible to trace the ultimate source or destination of the funds. Sarah had identified something else that was potentially even more significant. The amounts being transferred are increasing, she pointed out, showing Park a chart of transaction volumes over time. 6 months ago, the average fake shipment was documented at around $50,000. Now they're averaging over $200,000, and some individual transactions are over $500,000. Park studied the chart with growing concern. That suggests they're either expanding their operations or preparing for something that requires significantly more funding than their previous activities. The breakthrough that tied everything together came when Sarah noticed that the largest transactions were always routed through a specific facility in Phoenix that hadn't appeared significant in her earlier analysis. The Phoenix warehouse handled fewer transactions than the other locations, but the individual amounts were consistently larger, and they always occurred within 48 hours of unusual activity at the other facilities. Phoenix is the central hub, Sarah realized, updating her timeline to highlight the connections. All the major transfers eventually flow through Phoenix before being distributed to final destinations. If we can monitor Phoenix, we might be able to identify the ultimate recipients of the terrorist financing. When they presented this analysis to Martinez and the task force leadership, the room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications. Sarah had not only identified the mechanism being used for terrorism financing but had also found the central choke point that could allow law enforcement to monitor and potentially disrupt the entire network. This changes everything, Martinez said finally. If Phoenix is the hub, then we can potentially identify every recipient of terrorist funding by monitoring that single location. But it also means that if the network suspects we're onto them, they'll shut down Phoenix and we'll lose our opportunity to track the final destinations. Agent Thompson had been reviewing classified intelligence reports while Sarah presented her analysis. There's something else we need to consider, he said. Intelligence indicates that the terrorist cells receiving this funding are planning something significant within the next month. If we move too early, we might prevent the funding but miss the opportunity to identify the operational plans. If we wait too long, we might be too late to prevent whatever they're planning. Sarah felt the weight of the decision being discussed. Her analysis had revealed a network that was providing funding for potential terrorist attacks, but the timing of any law enforcement action would determine whether those attacks could be prevented or would proceed with funding from other sources. What if we don't have to choose, she suggested. What if we can monitor the network without disrupting it, at least initially? The timing patterns I've identified suggest that we have approximately 10 days before the next major transfer cycle. If we can set up comprehensive surveillance during that time, we might be able to track both the funding and the operational planning simultaneously. Martinez looked intrigued. Explain what you're thinking. Sarah moved to the whiteboard again, sketching out a surveillance strategy based on her analysis of the network's operations. The fake shipping records are created in a specific sequence that corresponds to the actual money transfers. If we monitor the creation of shipping documents at each facility, we can predict when transfers will occur and track them in real time without interfering with the process. Park added her own insights to Sarah's strategy. We could also monitor the legitimate businesses that are being used as cover for the operations. Many of the shell companies have real employees who probably don't know they're working for a terrorism financing network. By watching their daily activities, we might be able to identify when something unusual is happening. Thompson was taking notes as they discussed the surveillance strategy. This approach would allow us to gather intelligence on both the financing network and the operational planning, but it would require unprecedented coordination between multiple agencies and field offices. The logistics alone would be challenging. The logistics would be worth it if we can prevent terrorist attacks while also dismantling the financing network, Martinez replied. Agent Chen, how confident are you in your timing predictions? Sarah considered the question carefully. The analysis had been thorough, but she was acutely aware that lives might depend on her accuracy. The patterns have been consistent for the 6 months of data I've analyzed, she said. Based on the historical timing, I'm confident that the next major transfer cycle will begin in 8 to 10 days. But I can't guarantee that external factors won't cause them to change their schedule. Martinez nodded. 8 to 10 days gives us enough time to coordinate surveillance, but not much margin for error. We're going to proceed with your surveillance strategy, but we'll also prepare rapid response capabilities in case we need to move quickly. The meeting concluded with assignments for each team member. Sarah would continue analyzing the data and refining her predictions about timing and transaction volumes. Park would coordinate with financial intelligence units to monitor bank accounts and wire transfers. Thompson would work with international partners to track communications between domestic and overseas operatives. As the other agents left the conference room, Martinez asked Sarah to stay behind. When they were alone, he sat down across from her with an expression that was both serious and concerned. Agent Chen, I want to make sure you understand the significance of what you've uncovered and what we're asking you to do, he began. Your analysis has revealed what appears to be the primary terrorism financing network operating in the United States. The intelligence we gather over the next 2 weeks will likely determine our ability to prevent multiple terrorist attacks. Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of the responsibility. At the same time, Martinez continued, I want you to know that you've already exceeded every expectation anyone had for a rookie agent. The work you've done is the kind of breakthrough that experienced agents might never achieve in their entire careers. Regardless of what happens in the next 2 weeks, you've proven that you belong in this field. Sarah felt a mixture of gratitude and determination. Thank you, sir. I won't let the team down. I know you won't, Martinez replied. But I also want you to be prepared for the possibility that this operation might put you in danger. If the terrorist network suspects that their financing has been compromised, they might take aggressive action to protect their operations. We'll provide security, but there's always risk involved in counter-terrorism work. Sarah had been so focused on the analysis that she hadn't fully considered the personal risks involved. The idea that her work might make her a target was sobering, but it also reinforced her determination to see the operation through to completion. I understand the risks, she said. But if there's a chance that my analysis can help prevent terrorist attacks, then I have to take those risks. Martinez stood up and shook her hand. That's exactly what I hoped you would say. Get some rest tonight, Agent Chen. Tomorrow we start the most important surveillance operation of our careers. As Sarah left the conference room, she realized that her life had changed completely in just a few days. The rookie who had been underestimated by her colleagues was now leading the analytical component of a national security operation. The next 2 weeks would determine whether her insights could help prevent terrorism and save lives. The surveillance operation began at dawn on a Tuesday morning with teams positioned around all 12 facilities simultaneously. Sarah found herself in the back of an unmarked van parked 3 blocks from the Phoenix warehouse, surrounded by monitoring equipment that could intercept electronic communications, track vehicle movements, and record financial transactions in real time. Agent Park sat beside her, coordinating with surveillance teams in the other 11 cities through encrypted communications. Martinez was in the command vehicle 50 yards away, overseeing the entire operation while maintaining contact with FBI headquarters and the Joint Terrorism Task Force leadership. "All teams report ready," came the voice through Sarah's earpiece. "Operation Lighthouse is now active." Sarah had suggested the operation name during the planning phase. A lighthouse warns ships away from dangerous rocks while guiding them safely to harbor. Their surveillance would hopefully guide law enforcement safely to the terrorists while warning potential victims away from danger. The first 3 days of surveillance produced steady intelligence without any major developments. The Phoenix warehouse operated exactly as Sarah's analysis had predicted, with employees arriving each morning to process shipping documents that corresponded to financial transfers she was tracking through the banking system. The fake shipments were being created with mundane efficiency by workers who appeared to have no idea they were documenting terrorism financing. "It's remarkable how normal it all looks," Park observed as they watched warehouse workers load trucks with boxes that Sarah's analysis indicated contained nothing more valuable than packing material. "These people are processing documents for millions of dollars in terrorism financing, and they think they're working for a legitimate logistics company." Sarah was monitoring multiple data streams on her laptop, tracking the creation of shipping documents across all 12 facilities. The timing patterns she had identified were holding steady, with a major transfer cycle scheduled to begin in 4 days. "The beauty of their system is that most of the people involved don't know what they're really doing," she replied. "The warehouse workers, the truck drivers, even the local managers probably think they're running normal businesses." The breakthrough came on the 4th day when Sarah noticed an anomaly in the pattern. The Phoenix warehouse was creating shipping documents at twice the normal rate, and the individual transaction amounts were significantly larger than her analysis had predicted. "Something's changed," she told Park, showing her the data streaming across her laptop screen. "They're accelerating their timeline and increasing their transaction volumes. Either they're preparing for something bigger than we anticipated, or they suspect surveillance and they're trying to move funds quickly before we can stop them." Park immediately contacted Martinez. "Command, we have a significant deviation from predicted patterns at Phoenix. Agent Chen believes they may be accelerating their timeline." Martinez's response was immediate. "All teams maintain positions. Chen, I need a detailed analysis of what you're seeing. Can you determine if this is operational acceleration or defensive reaction to surveillance?" Sarah spent the next hour analyzing the transaction patterns and comparing them with historical data from the other facilities. What she found made her stomach clench with anxiety. "It's operational acceleration," she reported. "The transaction amounts and timing suggest they're moving funds for something that requires significantly more money than their previous activities. And, based on the geographic distribution of the transfers, whatever they're planning involves multiple cities simultaneously." Thompson's voice came through the encrypted communications from the Intelligence Coordination Center. "Intercepts confirm increased communications between domestic and overseas operatives. References to the celebration and gifts for the homeland suggest they're preparing for coordinated attacks timed to coincide with a significant anniversary." Sarah pulled up a calendar and cross-referenced the accelerated timeline with upcoming dates that might have symbolic significance for terrorist organizations. "If they maintain the current pace of fund transfers, they'll complete their financing in 6 days," she calculated. "That would put their operational timeline at." She paused, realizing what date the timeline pointed to. "The anniversary of 9/11, Park said quietly, reaching the same conclusion. "They're planning coordinated attacks for September 11th. The revelation transformed the operation from a surveillance mission into a race against time." Martinez made the decision to continue monitoring for one more day while rapidly developing plans for coordinated arrests across all 12 cities. "We need to balance two priorities," he explained during an emergency briefing that evening. "We need to prevent the attacks, but we also need to gather enough evidence to ensure successful prosecutions and to identify any other cells that might not be connected to this financing network." Sarah was asked to refine her timeline predictions and identify the optimal moment for coordinated arrests that would maximize evidence gathering while ensuring the prevention of terrorist attacks. The analysis required her to process data streams from all 12 surveillance teams while factoring in intelligence assessments about the suspected terrorists' operational planning. "Based on the transaction patterns and the accelerated timeline, I believe we have a 48-hour window starting tomorrow morning," she concluded. "If we move too early, we might not have evidence of the final fund transfers that would prove the terrorism connections. If we wait too long, the funds will be distributed to operational cells and the attacks might proceed even if we arrest the financing coordinators." The decision to proceed with arrests was made at the highest levels of government. Sarah found herself in the unprecedented position of briefing senior FBI officials about timing and coordination requirements based on her analysis of financial transaction patterns. The coordinated arrests began at exactly 6 a.m. Eastern Time, with teams moving simultaneously on targets in all 12 cities. Sarah monitored the operation from the command center, tracking real-time intelligence as teams secured evidence and arrested suspects at each facility. Phoenix team reports warehouse secured, 12 suspects in custody, computers and financial records seized, came the first report. Similar reports followed from Newark, Miami, Houston, Los Angeles, and the other facilities. Within 2 hours, the entire financing network had been dismantled and 47 suspects were in custody. But the operation revealed something that Sarah's analysis hadn't anticipated. The Phoenix warehouse contained evidence that the network was planning not just coordinated attacks for September 11, but was also serving as a backup financing system for other terrorist cells operating independently. "We found communications indicating at least 3 other active plots that were receiving funding through this network," Thompson reported. The timing analysis that identified the September 11th anniversary was correct, but there are additional threats that we're still working to identify. Sarah realized that her role in the operation was far from over. The financial data seized from the 12 facilities contained information about fund transfers that stretched back over 2 years and extended to recipients that hadn't been identified in her original analysis. "Agent Chen," Martinez said, "we need you to expand your analysis to include all the historical data we've seized. The patterns you identified in the recent transactions might help us understand the full scope of this network's activities and identify threats that are still active." The next several weeks involved the most intensive analytical work of Sarah's career. Working with a team of financial investigators and intelligence analysts, she traced fund transfers that revealed connections to terrorist plots in Europe, Africa, and Asia. The Newark warehouse alone had processed over $50 million in terrorism financing over the previous 18 months. Her analysis revealed that the network they had dismantled was far more significant than anyone had initially realized. It wasn't just one group planning coordinated attacks, it was a sophisticated financial infrastructure that had been supporting international terrorism operations worldwide. "The shipping record methodology that you identified in Newark was being replicated in at least 15 other countries," Park explained as they reviewed the expanded analysis. "Law enforcement agencies in Europe and Asia are using your analytical framework to identify similar operations in their jurisdictions." The international implications of Sarah's work became clear when she was asked to brief representatives from allied intelligence agencies about the patterns she had identified. The analytical techniques she had developed for tracking fake shipping records became a model for identifying terrorism financing networks globally. But the most satisfying outcome was the prevention of the coordinated attacks that had been planned for September 11. Intelligence gathered during the arrests revealed detailed operational plans for simultaneous attacks on transportation infrastructure in New York, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, and Chicago. "The funding you tracked through the Phoenix warehouse was designated for acquiring explosives and coordinating timing across multiple attack teams," Thompson briefed her during one of their debriefing sessions. "Without that funding, the operational cells were unable to proceed with their plans. Your analysis didn't just help us arrest the financiers, it directly prevented terrorist attacks that could have killed hundreds of people. Sarah found it difficult to process the magnitude of what her work had accomplished. The analysis that had started as an attempt to prove herself as a capable agent had resulted in the prevention of major terrorist attacks and the dismantling of an international financing network. 3 months after the coordinated arrests, Sarah received a commendation from the FBI director and a promotion that moved her from rookie status to senior investigative analyst. More importantly to her, she had earned the respect of colleagues who no longer saw her as someone who had been underestimated, but as someone who had proven herself under the most demanding circumstances possible. You know, Martinez told her during the commendation ceremony, when this operation started, some people questioned whether a rookie should be given such significant responsibilities. Now those same people are trying to recruit you for their own teams. Sarah appreciated the recognition, but she had learned something important about herself during the operation. She didn't need others' validation to know her worth, and she didn't need to prove herself by accepting assignments that were beyond her current capabilities. I'm grateful for the opportunities I've been given, she replied, but I think I'd like to focus on developing expertise in financial investigation techniques. There are probably other networks out there using similar methods, and I'd like to be ready when we need to find them. Martinez smiled. That's exactly what I hoped you would say. We're establishing a new unit focused on tracking terrorism financing through sophisticated analytical techniques. Are you interested in leading the development of that unit? Sarah looked around the room at her colleagues, people who had gone from underestimating her to trusting her with critical responsibilities. She thought about the shipping records that had started her on this journey and the patterns that had revealed themselves to someone who looked at data without preconceptions about what she should find. Yes, she said. I'm very interested. The rookie who had been assigned to data entry and dismissed by her colleagues was about to become the founding leader of a new counterterrorism unit. The mission that no one else could finish had become the foundation for her career and the beginning of her reputation as one of the Bureau's most effective analytical investigators. But, more than personal success, Sarah knew that her work was helping to keep people safe. The patterns she had identified in mundane shipping records had revealed threats that could have claimed innocent lives. That knowledge would guide her work for years to come, ensuring that she never forgot the real purpose behind the analysis and investigation. 2 years after the operation that dismantled the Meridian Corporation network, Sarah Chen stood before a packed auditorium at the FBI Academy, delivering a lecture on advanced financial pattern recognition to a class of new recruits. The young faces looking back at her reminded her of herself just a few years earlier, eager to prove themselves, uncertain about their capabilities, and probably wondering if they would ever be taken seriously by their more experienced colleagues. Financial crimes investigation isn't about having perfect intuition or natural detective abilities, Sarah told the recruits. It's about developing systematic approaches to data analysis and being willing to question assumptions that more experienced investigators might take for granted. The Counterterrorism Financial Analysis Unit that Sarah now led had grown to 12 full-time investigators and had assisted in operations that prevented 17 separate terrorist plots across North America and Europe. The analytical techniques she had developed for tracking fake shipping records had been adapted for use with cryptocurrency transactions, international wire transfers, and even social media communications patterns. But success had brought new challenges that Sarah was still learning to navigate. Her unit was now being consulted on cases involving state-sponsored terrorism financing, international money laundering operations that involved legitimate government officials, and cyber-terrorism threats that required entirely new analytical approaches. Agent Chen, one of the recruits, asked during the question period following her lecture, "How do you know when you found a pattern that's actually significant versus something that just looks important because you want to find something?" Sarah smiled, remembering asking similar questions when she was starting her career. "That's one of the most important questions in investigative analysis," she replied. "The answer is that you have to be willing to challenge your own findings constantly. Every pattern needs to be verified through multiple independent data sources, and you have to be prepared to abandon theories that don't hold up to scrutiny." The question reminded her of a case her unit was currently investigating that had been testing exactly those principles. 6 months ago, banks in several major cities had reported unusual transaction patterns that appeared to involve sophisticated money laundering techniques. The initial analysis suggested connections to international terrorism financing, but Sarah's team had been unable to verify the patterns through independent sources. Sometimes what appears to be a significant pattern is actually just coincidence amplified by confirmation bias, she continued. Other times, patterns that seem insignificant turn out to be the key to understanding much larger operations. The only way to distinguish between the two is through rigorous analytical methodology and constant verification. After her lecture, Sarah returned to her office in the Financial Crimes Division, where Agent Park was waiting with an update on the bank transaction case that had been troubling them. "I think I know why we haven't been able to verify the terrorism connections," Park said, spreading several charts across Sarah's desk. "The transactions we've been tracking aren't related to terrorism financing at all. They're part of a domestic money laundering operation that's being run by organized crime families." Sarah studied the charts, which showed transaction patterns that were superficially similar to the terrorism financing networks they typically investigated but followed different geographical and timing patterns. "What made you realize the difference?" "The timing was wrong for terrorism financing," Park explained. "The transaction cycles correspond to drug trafficking schedules and seasonal variations in illegal gambling rather than the operational planning patterns we see with terrorist networks." Sarah nodded, appreciating both the analytical insight and the reminder that pattern recognition required constant validation. "Have you contacted the Organized Crime Task Force?" "They're sending over agents this afternoon to review our analysis," Park replied. "It turns out they've been tracking the same network from a completely different angle, but they hadn't identified the financial patterns that we found." The collaboration between different law enforcement units had become one of the most satisfying aspects of Sarah's work. The analytical techniques her unit had developed were proving useful for investigations far beyond terrorism financing, and sharing expertise across different specializations was producing results that none of the units could have achieved independently. Sarah's phone rang, interrupting her review of the organized crime analysis. The call was from Agent Martinez, who had been promoted to head the entire counter-terrorism division and remained one of Sarah's most trusted mentors. "Sarah, we have a situation that requires your unit's expertise," Martinez said. "Intelligence has identified communications between domestic extremist groups and international terrorist organizations, but the financial connections are unlike anything we've seen before. Can you bring your team to the secure briefing room in 30 minutes? Sarah gathered her senior investigators and headed to the briefing room, wondering what new challenge would test their analytical capabilities. Over the past 2 years, each major case had required them to adapt their techniques and develop new approaches to pattern recognition. The briefing room contained representatives from the FBI, Homeland Security, the Treasury Department, and several other agencies that Sarah didn't immediately recognize. The presence of so many different organizations suggested that this case involved threats that crossed multiple jurisdictional boundaries. "Agent Chen," Martinez began, "we need your unit to analyze financial transactions that appear to involve domestic extremist groups receiving funding from overseas terrorist organizations. The complexity of the financial networks makes traditional investigation methods insufficient." Treasury Department Agent Williams took over the briefing, displaying charts that showed financial flows between bank accounts, cryptocurrency wallets, and international money transfer services. The funding mechanisms involve combinations of traditional banking, digital currencies, and informal money transfer systems that create an analytical challenge we've never encountered before. Sarah studied the charts, immediately recognizing similarities to patterns her unit had identified in previous cases. "The multi-layered approach is designed to make tracking impossible using conventional methods," she observed. "But the underlying structure still has to follow logical patterns based on the operational requirements of the groups involved." Agent Thompson, who had worked with Sarah on the original Meridian Corporation case, added context about the intelligence aspects of the investigation. "Communications intercepts indicate that the domestic extremist groups are planning coordinated actions, but we haven't been able to determine the scope or timeline based on the communications alone. The financial analysis might be our best opportunity to understand their operational planning." Sarah's team spent the next several hours reviewing the financial data, identifying transaction patterns that revealed connections between seemingly unrelated accounts and organizations. The analysis required combining techniques they had developed for tracking terrorism financing with new approaches for analyzing cryptocurrency transactions and international money transfers. "The patterns are definitely there," Agent Davis from Sarah's unit reported after the initial analysis. "But the timeline is compressed compared to what we've seen with traditional terrorism financing. Instead of transfers occurring over weeks or months, these transactions are happening over days or even hours." Sarah realized that the compressed timeline might indicate something significant about the extremist group's operational planning. If they're moving funds quickly, it suggests they're either planning imminent action or they're concerned about law enforcement detection. Either way, we probably don't have much time to complete our analysis. The next 72 hours involved the most intensive analytical effort Sarah's unit had ever undertaken. Working around the clock, they traced financial connections that revealed a network of domestic extremist groups that were receiving funding and operational support from international terrorist organizations. But the most disturbing discovery was that the network was planning coordinated attacks designed to maximize social disruption during a period of political tension. The financial analysis revealed payments for weapons, explosives, and communication equipment that suggested attacks on infrastructure targets in multiple states. The funding patterns indicate they're planning simultaneous attacks on power grids, transportation hubs, and communication networks, Sarah briefed the interagency task force. "The objective appears to be creating widespread chaos rather than maximizing casualties, which suggests they're trying to destabilize social and economic systems." Martinez made the decision to proceed with coordinated arrests based on Sarah's analysis, even though the investigation was still ongoing. "We can't risk waiting for more complete intelligence if there's a possibility that infrastructure attacks are imminent," he explained. The arrests were carried out simultaneously across 8 states, with law enforcement teams coordinating to prevent the extremist cells from communicating with each other or with their overseas contacts. Sarah's financial analysis had identified not only the domestic operatives but also the international money transfer networks that were supporting their activities. The evidence seized during the arrests confirmed that Sarah's analysis had been accurate. The extremist groups had been planning coordinated attacks on critical infrastructure that could have caused widespread power outages, transportation disruptions, and communication failures across multiple states. The financial intelligence you developed was critical to understanding both the scope of the threat and the timeline for the planned attacks, Thompson told Sarah during the post-operation briefing. "Without your analysis, we would have been investigating these groups as separate domestic threats without recognizing the international coordination and support." The successful prevention of the infrastructure attacks represented another milestone in Sarah's career, but she was beginning to understand that each success brought new responsibilities and more complex challenges. Her unit was being consulted on cases that involved national security threats at the highest levels, and the analytical techniques they developed were being applied to threats that she couldn't have imagined when she started her career. 6 months after the infrastructure attack case, Sarah received an unexpected phone call from the FBI director's office. She was being offered the opportunity to lead a new interagency task force focused on emerging threats that combine terrorism, organized crime, and cyber warfare. Agent Chen, the director, explained during their meeting, "The threats we're facing are becoming increasingly complex and interconnected. Traditional law enforcement approaches that treat terrorism, organized crime, and cyber threats as separate problems are proving insufficient. We need investigators who can identify patterns and connections across different types of criminal and terrorist activities." Sarah considered the offer carefully. Leading an interagency task force would mean giving up direct control over the unit she had built and accepting responsibilities that would test her leadership abilities in new ways. "What kind of threats are we talking about?" she asked. "Criminal organizations that are using terrorist financing techniques to fund cyber attacks on government and private sector targets," the director replied. "Terrorist groups that are collaborating with organized crime to smuggle weapons and explosives. State-sponsored actors who are supporting domestic extremist groups to destabilize American society. These threats don't fit neatly into traditional investigative categories." Sarah realized that accepting the position would mean confronting the most complex and dangerous threats facing national security. It would also mean building teams and developing analytical approaches for problems that had never been systematically addressed before. The reason we're offering this position to you, the director continued, is that you've demonstrated the ability to identify patterns and connections that other investigators miss. Your work on the Meridian Corporation case showed that you could find solutions to problems that had stumped more experienced agents. The infrastructure attack investigation proved that you could adapt your techniques to new types of threats. Sarah thought about her journey from being the underestimated rookie who was assigned to data entry to being offered leadership of a task force addressing the most complex threats facing the country. The opportunity represented both professional advancement and the chance to continue developing innovative approaches to national security challenges. "I'll accept the position," she said, "but I want to maintain connections to the financial analysis unit and continue developing the analytical techniques that have proven effective in our previous cases." "That's exactly what we hoped you would say," the director replied. "The task force will be built around the principle that effective counterterrorism and law enforcement requires combining expertise across different specializations rather than maintaining separate silos." 3 months later, Sarah stood in a conference room filled with representatives from 12 different federal agencies, briefing them on the mission and objectives of the new Interagency Threat Assessment Task Force. Looking around the room at investigators, analysts, and specialists who had initially questioned whether someone with her limited experience could lead such a complex organization, she reflected on how much had changed since her first day as a rookie agent. "Our mission is to identify and respond to threats that cross traditional boundaries between terrorism, organized crime, and cyber warfare," she told the assembled team. "We're going to succeed by combining analytical techniques from different disciplines and by maintaining the flexibility to adapt our approaches as new threats emerge." The rookie who had been underestimated by her colleagues was now leading a task force that would define how law enforcement addressed emerging national security threats. The mission that had seemed impossible when she started her career had become the foundation for innovations that would protect the country for years to come. But Sarah never forgot the lessons she had learned during those early days when nobody expected her to accomplish anything significant. The most important insights often came from the most unexpected sources, and the most effective solutions usually emerged from questioning assumptions that more experienced people took for granted. The shipping records that had started her career as a serious investigator were still framed on her office wall, reminding her that complex threats could often be understood through careful analysis of seemingly mundane data. That principle would guide her work as she faced whatever new challenges emerged in an increasingly dangerous and interconnected world.